When the tanks rolled into Hungary, the civilian population ran for their lives. Soldiers found themselves pointing guns at their former comrades. But this was not a battle between soldiers. Instead, the enemy was a civilian population. An army trained for war was in confrontation with the men and women in the streets. Did these soldiers feel troubled at having to fight their fellow countrymen? Arthur Charles Parfitt, author of the book Trespass Under Arms, believes that troops have no place in a civilian struggle. He's been accused of inciting 2 British soldiers to desert their regiment in Northern Ireland. Today, Parfitt enters the witness box to give his interpretation of loyalty and personal responsibility.
Mr. Parfitt, are you a law-abiding man?
Yes, I think so.
Have you ever knowingly broken the law?
I was once found guilty of assaulting a policeman. That was after a public meeting in Trafalgar Square in 1956. I was fined £25, but I'm afraid I couldn't agree with the verdict.
Did you actually assault the policeman?
I wouldn't have had the nerve. No, I was grabbed indiscriminately, and the next morning found myself in the magistrate's court. But still, £25 was a good deal less than it might have been, so perhaps there was some doubt on the bench as well.
Do you think you were unfairly treated on that occasion?
Not really. The police and the magistrates have a difficult job to do sometimes. I wasn't breaking the law, but I can see that they might have thought I was.
So you have never knowingly broken the law?
No, never.
Have you ever advocated law-breaking?
Certainly not.
In your books or in your lectures, have you ever recommended a course of action that, in your opinion, might have led to law-breaking?
In my own mind, never. But of course, one can't be sure of how people will interpret what one says. It's one of the ironies of human history that good words are quoted by evil men to justify their actions. I believe Hitler used to quote Shakespeare to justify his treatment of the Jews. Obviously, he never got as far as Antonio's speech. The devil can cite scripture for his purpose.
Yes. Now, Mr. Parfitt, I should like to clear up the question of the invitation you did or did not extend to troopers Dugdale and Fisk. Now, may we start from the very first time Dugdale wrote to you?
Yes, indeed. That was in October, I think. As he says, he wrote asking for a book list. I wasn't quite sure what he was after, but I jotted down a few names and sent it to him. The subject isn't easy. It touches on international law, the Geneva Convention, and various other agreements, but I sent and suggested a few general works.
As far as you know, did Dugdale read any of these books you suggested?
No, it seems not.
And these books, did any of them express a view different from your own?
Good heavens. You'd have a job finding 2 authorities who agreed. And, Mr. Lotterby, if I may, I'd like to settle once and for all what we're really talking about.
Yes, that might be helpful.
It's not really political science. It's much nearer to moral philosophy. And I suggest we start with Socrates himself.
Start with Socrates?
There's no better place, my lord.
Would you be drawing comparison with yourself and Socrates, Mr. Parfitt?
He was accused of corrupting the youth of Athens.
Yes, I did know that, Mr. Parfitt. However, I don't think this is the place for a philosophy lecture. If your views are relevant to your defence, perhaps we could hear it in a few brief words.
If I can, my lord. My whole thesis centres on personal responsibility. On the one hand, it rests on existentialism. On the other hand...
Mr. Parfitt, brief words, words that we can all understand.
Perhaps I can help, my lord.
Oh, I do wish you would.
Mr. Parfitt, for the sake of brevity, do you believe that each man is responsible for his own actions?
I believe that the good society offers every man his freedom in exchange for responsible actions.
Now, that really wasn't very difficult, was it, Mr. Parfitt?
It leaves aside the question of cause, method, and motive.
I'm afraid we shall have to stifle our disappointment in these respects, Mr. Parfitt. Please continue, Mr. Lotterby.
Right, my lord. Mr. Parfitt, did you invite Dugdale and Fisk to your home on the evening of December the 30th last year?
No. What I said was that if they happened to be in the neighbourhood of Fulchester, I'd be happy to arrange a meeting at some convenient time.
And was a time and a date agreed?
No. The last letter I had from Mr. Dugdale told me that he hoped to be coming over to England in the new year, and that he'd telephone and arrange a meeting.
But you didn't give an open invitation.
I couldn't possibly. I have so many engagements.
So when Dugdale and Fisk turned up that Saturday night, you were surprised.
Astonished.
But you invited them in.
Well, what else could I do? We hadn't got much food in the house, but Mrs. Cummings, my housekeeper, made them up some sort of a meal, and we put them in the spare room for the night.
Now, Mr. Parfitt, without going into any technical language, can you tell us what you talked about that evening?
It wasn't a very profound discussion. We talked about personal responsibility, right and wrong, evaluation, judgment.
Did your guests take an equal part in the discussion?
Mr. Dugdale asked quite a lot of questions. He's got an inquiry mind, as the Major said. But he was looking for justifications rather than the truth. Working from a hypothesis is one thing. Looking for excuses is quite different.
Excuses?
Well, Dugdale had a grudge. He felt the army had treated him badly. Take the question of losing his stripe. Well, he felt that he'd been victimized by the sergeant major and let down by the officer. I think he wanted to get his own back.
Well, what do you base this on?
Well, just on some of his questions. Should one always obey senior officers? What should one do if one was given an objectionable order? We're nearly back to, is it right to gas Jews?
Did Trooper Fisk ask many questions?
I can't remember him asking any.
None at all.
I think he asked if they were showing Match of the Day on television.
So he didn't contribute very much?
No.
Do you think he gained much?
I find it difficult to believe he did.
And Trooper Dugdale?
Well, he would take out what he wanted from the conversation and ignore the rest. He wasn't in honest pursuit of knowledge.
Did you say to the two soldiers, you should get yourselves out of it?
Yes, I may have done.
And what were you referring to?
The dilemma they were in.
And what dilemma was this?
Well, Dugdale had a vast chip on his shoulder about the army. Fisk, well, he was out of step with everything. And I said that they should face up to their responsibilities.
And you repeated this when they left?
I did.
Now, Mr. Parfitt, we heard Major Hughes describe your book as seditious nonsense. Has anyone ever accused you of sedition before?
Never.
You talk to you lecture to a wide variety of people. What sort of people?
Well, where does one start? The conservative women's clubs, Christian societies, and even to a group of army officers once.
And were you ever accused of sedition at any of these lectures?
Far from it.
Thank you, Mr. Parfitt.
Mr. Parfitt, do you think you could do my job or my learned friends?
I've never really thought about it.
Well, that's not quite true, is it? Didn't you once plan to make a career of law?
Oh, that's so long ago that I hardly remember.
Even though you went through all the turmoil of studying for and failing your bar examinations?
I'm over 70, sir. I'm familiar with turmoil.
However, the law has always fascinated you, its rules and its loopholes.
Well, show me a human institution, and I'll show you the loopholes. Is the law any different?
Or the army, Mr. Parfitt? You tried your hand at that too, didn't you?
50 years ago, I was of an age to experiment. I wasn't right for the army, I wasn't right for the law, but I've survived.
Did you buy yourself out of the army?
I didn't have the funds.
Yet the army gave you a complete discharge. Anyone would think they were glad to see the back of you.
It isn't exactly the most imaginative of institutions.
Oh, you mean they didn't appreciate you?
The feeling was mutual.
Really? And you accuse young Trooper Dugdale of having a chip on his shoulder?
At his age, I might have felt the same.
And not just at his age, Mr. Parfitt. I put it to you that 50 years have not wiped away one iota of the humiliation you suffered at being chucked out by both the army and by the law. And I put it to you that in the years between you've lost no opportunity of ridiculing and undermining first one institution and then the other.
Justify that remark.
My justification sits there, a victim of your bitterness, of your determination to get even with the institutions that kicked you out.
All I can say of you, sir, is that the law's gain is the music hall's loss.
That sort of remark doesn't assist you, Mr. Parfitt.
It isn't original, my lord.
You may withdraw it if you wish.
Is it that important?
It would be wise.
Very well, my lord. The law's gain is not the music hall's loss.
Are you being deliberately contemptuous, Mr. Parfitt?
In defending myself against prosecuting counsel's lies and insults, my lord, I feel I've shown great restraint.
I am referring to your most improper remark about the music hall. I give you one last chance, Mr. Parfitt.
I withdraw my improper remark about the music hall, my
I
lord.
cannot imagine what effect you hope to create with the jury by such impertinence.
I trust the jury will be aware of the provocation.
That will do, Mr. Parfitt. Continue, Mr. Golding.
My lord. Mr. Parfitt, you told the court that at a public meeting in Trafalgar Square in 1956, a police constable unwisely got in your way. A little misunderstanding that cost you £25. But tell us what really happened.
Certainly. It was on November the 4th, 4 days after Britain and France had attacked Egypt. There was a great deal of public feeling.
Among left-wingers and dissidents, I believe.
And even inside the Conservative Party, sir. But then, you may be too young to remember that.
I was talking about the mobs attacking government property.
Bad government produces mobs. Most people are so lethargic, it takes blatant incompetence to get them out onto the streets.
You among them, Mr. Parfitt.
Yes.
Howling for the Prime Minister's blood.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Oh, don't tell us you went to Trafalgar Square merely out of academic interest.
I went because I was angry.
Angry enough to damage government property and assault policemen.
No, sir. Suez and the government were not in my mind that night.
Not in your mind, really, Mr. Parfitt. You must think we're very naive.
Not naive, sir. Forgetful. On November the 4th, Russian tanks entered Budapest and murdered Hungarian civilians in the streets. Egypt was a blunder. Budapest was a tragedy. That's what was in my mind, sir. That's what made me angry.
Tanks in Budapest, Mr. Parfitt. Armed troops in the streets.
Yes.
And it made you very angry.
Didn't it make you angry?
Indeed. It's not something you forget. And I can imagine those news photographs burned themselves into your soul.
Yes.
So that 17 years later, you can still recall, as we see, the passion you felt at the time. And that evening on December the 30th, you remembered it then. Am I right? What chemistry had taken place in your mind during those years, no one can say. But when you saw those two young soldiers sitting across the room, a spark leapt across those 17 years. You remember the bodies in the streets, the burnt buildings, and if you needed reminding, there was Prague, 1968, the tanks again, the troops jostling the people.
Yes. And Berlin and Athens and Santiago.
And Belfast and Londonderry, yes?
Yes. No, not the same. We are not ruled by colonels yet.
Yet?
Nor shall be, I believe.
Do you really believe that?
I've just said so.
I'd like to go back to these lectures you give. Now, we've heard about conservative ladies and Christians and army officers, but would you say these particular groups are representative of your audiences?
I speak to a great many people.
For instance, anarchist groups, yes? Arab nationalists?
Yes.
And Irish militants?
Yes, once.
Would you call yourself a pacifist, Mr. Parfitt?
No.
The very opposite, in fact. You're an activist, aren't you, Mr. Parfitt? Your background left you no other course. A failed lawyer, a failed soldier, a bitter, disillusioned man who used the tragedies of his time as a sort of a mirror. And in that mirror you saw an avenging angel, avenging the wrongs of the world and avenging yourself against your old enemies at the same time. It may not even have occurred to you that in your distorted view of history would, in the end, put this young man behind bars for many years.
Is that a question, my lord?
If you care to answer, then it is.
I don't think I'll waste the court's time.
Mr. Golding?
No more questions, my lord.
Do you wish to re-examine Mr. Lottery?
Just briefly, my lord. Mr. Parfitt, did you really confuse Londonderry with Budapest?
I find that suggestion most offensive.
And when you read of these desertions, what did you feel? Pleasure, satisfaction?
Shock, sorrow. What else could one feel? Listening to Trooper Dugdale in court, I can only tell you that I'm very grateful my conscience is clear.
And finally, Mr. Parfitt, do you really hate the legal profession and the army?
Do you imagine I'd give up valuable time to lecture people I hated? As for the law, I've no doubt at all Mr. Bumble was wrong.
Thank you, Mr. Parfitt.
You may return to the dock, Mr. Parfitt.
My last witness is Mrs. Winifred Cummings.
Winifred Cummings, please.
Are you Mrs. Winifred Cummings?
Yes.
And do you live at 14 Hazel Grove, Fulchester?
Yes, I live in.
What is your job, Mrs. Cummings?
I'm housekeeper to Mr. Parfitt.
How long have you been housekeeper to Mr. Parfitt?
Oh, about 5 years. Mr. Parfitt's always lived in Fulchester, but after Mrs. Parfitt passed away, he got rid of the other house and he bought this smaller one. I used to clean for...
Does Mr. Parfitt entertain much? Have people to stay?
Oh, no, very seldom.
How often, would you say?
Well, in all the years I've known him, perhaps 4 or 5 times.
People staying the night, just dropping in?
Oh, they do stay the night sometimes, but he hates people dropping in.
Mrs. Cummings, I want you to think back to December the 30th last year.
Oh, that was the night when the two...
Let me finish, please.
Sorry, sir.
That's all right. Did Mr. Parfitt have visitors that night?
Yes, 2 young soldiers. That's one of them there, I think. The other one...
Were they friends of Mr. Parfitt's?
Oh, no, he'd never seen them before. No. I think they'd written to him, but then lots of people write to him and he doesn't know most of them.
Can you remember how Mr. Parfitt reacted when these two turned up?
Well, to tell you the truth, he wasn't too pleased. You see, he got a lot of work to do and it was all laid out on his desk.
Was he expecting them?
Oh, no, they came right out of the blue. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had his work all laid out, would he?
No. And you prepared a meal?
Sardines on toast, I ask you. But they should have let us know.
If you'd known they were coming, what difference would that have made?
Well, I'd have got something in, a roast perhaps, and then the sheets would have been aired.
Oh, weren't the sheets aired?
No, but when I knew they were staying the night, I took them off the bed and I brought them down and I put them in front of the kitchen fire. They weren't too bad.
Can you tell us, did you go into the sitting room that evening?
Oh, I went in a couple of times, once to ask about the beds and that, and once to take some coffee in.
Were you in the room when Mr. Parfitt was talking or when these two visitors were talking?
I suppose they must have been talking some of the time.
Yes. Do you remember anything that was said?
I remember Ireland was mentioned. That young gentleman said something about Ireland.
Do you remember anything that Mr. Parfitt said?
Yes. Salmon fishing. Mr. Parfitt said that salmon fishing was good in Ireland.
Is that all?
That's all that I can remember.
Yes. Now, just one last question, Mrs. Cummings. You've known Mr. Parfitt for 5 years. What sort of man would you say he was?
Mr. Parfitt? The best you could find. That's what he is. A good man. A gentleman.
Thank you, Mrs. Cummings.
Mrs. Cummings, you've been housekeeper to the defendant for 5 years. And would you say he was a tidy, methodical man? Is his work always neatly filed away?
Well, to tell the truth, not bad, but not brilliant. Men aren't all that tidy, I find.
Sometimes he forgot where he put things.
That's right.
Well, at over 70, that's not surprising, is it?
No, of course not.
We all forget things, and I'm sure a busy man like the defendant has a lot of things on his mind.
Yes.
Which explains, very simply, why you were both caught out on the night of December the 30th. And Mr. Parfitt had forgotten the 2 soldiers were coming, and he hadn't told you, so you couldn't remind him.
No, he didn't say anything to me.
Well, he'd forgotten, hadn't he? Oh, please don't think I'm criticising him, Mrs. Cummings. We all forget things. And on this occasion, Mr. Parfitt had forgotten.
Well, it wasn't quite like that.
But you've just said he didn't tell you.
But he didn't know they were coming.
Oh, that's what you think, Mrs. Cummings. Can you be sure, absolutely sure, that he had not forgotten?
Well, yes, I think so.
Now, the sheets for the beds, Mrs. Cummings, in the spare room. I suppose they were kept in a chest of drawers?
Apart from when they were on the bed, yes.
On the bed?
Yes. I always made the beds up in case anybody came, and then when I knew they were coming, I just slipped a bottle in.
Oh, so it didn't matter who came or when, there was always a bedful?
That's right.
Well, Mrs. Cummings, this is a rather important point, and I want to be quite sure we all understand what you're saying. Now, in the defendant's house at Hazel Grove, there is a spare bedroom, yes?
Yes.
And in it, there are 2 beds, which are always made up with bedclothes in case someone wants to stay the night.
Yes, then I just put the bottles in.
Quite. Now, you told my learned friend that Mr. Parfitt didn't like people just dropping in and staying the night.
No, he didn't.
Then why did you have the beds made up? Surely it would have been more sensible if they were going to be used so little just to strip them and only make them up when they were needed.
I didn't keep them made up all the time.
Why not?
Well, like you said, there was no point.
In fact, you only made them up when you had advance notice of someone coming, and then you just slipped the hot water bottle in.
I put both bottles in that morning.
Now, you've told my learned friend you stripped the sheets off the beds on the evening of December the 30th to air them in front of the fire, which means that the beds were made up.
Yes.
Which you only did when you were expecting someone.
Well...
That's what you said, Mrs. Cummings.
Did I?
Yes. Which means that 2 people were expected on the night of December the 30th. Thank you.
Mrs. Cummings, I must say I found all this talk about beds and sheets and hot water bottles all rather confusing. And with respect, I think my learned friend has too. For one moment he's suggesting that Mr. Parfitt forgot to tell you that these 2 soldiers were coming, and the next he's suggesting you knew all the time because you made the beds up. Now, for everyone's benefit, Mrs. Cummings, can you clear this matter up for us? Were you expecting visitors on the night of December the 30th?
No, sir.
Do you think Mr. Parfitt was expecting visitors?
No.
Do the beds have anything to do with it?
No, sir.
Thank you, Mrs. Cummings.
You may stand down, Mrs. Cummings.
That concludes the case for the defence, my lord.
Members of the jury, a man is guilty of an offence contrary to the Incitement to Disaffection Act 1934 if he endeavours to seduce any member of Her Majesty's forces from his duty to Her Majesty. Now, it is no offence to discuss the situation in Northern Ireland, and it is no offence to say if the army ought not to be there. But it is an offence if a person advises a soldier to desert. Well, now, you may think that these 2 soldiers would have deserted in any event, but that is immaterial. The question is whether the accused encouraged them. And if he did, he's guilty. Now, you must remember that the prosecution must prove this beyond all reasonable doubt. If you have a reasonable doubt, you must find the accused not guilty. Will you now retire and consider your verdict?
All stand.
Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
On the charge of incitement to disaffection, do you find the defendant guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Mr. Parfitt, you've been found not guilty by this court and are free to leave.
Court will rise.
Next week, you can join another jury when our cameras return to watch a leading case in the Crown Court.